This is Andrew Paul Cronin, and you're listening to the Q&A with A.P.C., the show that features conversations with artists, cultural figures, policymakers, performers, and other innovators living in Virginia. Episode 15, William Geroux. My guest, William Geroux, is a journalist and author who wrote for the Richmond Times-Dispatch for 25 years. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Associated Press, and various regional magazines and newspapers. His book, The Mathews Men, 7 Brothers in the War Against Hitler's U-Boats, was released in April. The book tells the true story of the U.S. Merchant Marine and one extraordinary family from Mathews County, Virginia, a remote peninsula located on the Chesapeake Bay. During the first year of World War II, virtually all the fuel, food, and munitions for the Allies traveled in merchant ships. These ships and the 7 brothers of the Hodges family suddenly found themselves as the primary targets of German U-boats. The Mathews Men will be released in paperback in March. This episode of the Q&A with A.P.C. was recorded at William's home in Virginia Beach, Virginia. So, William Bill Geroux, where were you born?
Born in Washington, D.C.
Oh, you're a rare district birth.
Yeah.
I feel like, because I'm Northern Virginia, so.
Yeah.
What did your parents do?
My father worked for the government. He was a World War II veteran who got a job with the Navy Department as a civilian, doing logistical work for the Navy Department in D.C.
And did you attend school in D.C.?
No, we didn't live there very long, and he got a job I think he still worked in the Navy Yard, but we moved into Fairfax County, Virginia, just outside of D.C., into, it was called Alexandria, but it was in Fairfax County.
Okay. So I grew up in Annandale.
Yeah.
Did you attend high school in Alexandria, in Fairfax?
I did. I went to Bishop Ireton High School.
Okay, so Catholic school.
Yeah.
Were you raised Catholic?
I was.
Yeah. How long did that last? Or is it still happening?
It's pretty much done with, but it's lasted certainly through school.
Brothers and sisters?
No, only child.
And what did your mom do?
She was a teacher. She was an elementary school teacher.
How did you like school? Like, were you a good student? Were you?
I was a very dedicated student, probably through high school, and then not so much during college. I went to college at William and Mary.
Okay. What did you do for fun?
Sports,
like on the team, like a city team or a county team, or like
intramural, just goofing around.
Okay,
really.
But nothing, no like high school sports or anything like that.
No, I was okay at that stuff, but nothing really, nothing great.
What was your major at William and Mary?
Education. I was going to be a teacher. I didn't really know if I wanted to be one, but it was sort of by default. I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and my mother was a very much of a first-rate teacher, and I was sort of I didn't really know if I wanted to be a teacher.
As the son of a teacher, what kind of things did you observe your mom doing as a teacher? Were there papers at home or certain stories at the dinner table that were talked about? Did you have an impression of what a teacher did or was?
She was just, I think she was just really well liked as a teacher. I knew a lot of the kids of various ages at the school, and they all seemed to look up to her, and she was a really good teacher. So she was just honestly sort of an admirable character. So I think I sort of went that way just because of a very good example. But again, my heart was never really into it. As I got more and more into it, I realized that teaching wasn't for me.
What was Dad's personality like?
He was a very funny guy. He was gone a lot. He had a lot of his job took him across the country a lot. His job would be to go and basically look into why, if something in the government wasn't getting where it was supposed to go, he was supposed to go there and figure out what the bottleneck was and fix it. So he was on the road a lot. So I was much closer to my mother.
Did he have stories from the war?
He never told them. He didn't. I was, I used to be very interested in it as a kid, and he took me to see a couple of movies. But I would ask him what he did, and he was, I never did anything. But he actually had. He was in the 82nd Airborne, but he served mostly in the infantry and saw a lot of fighting. He was at the Battle of the Bulge and fought in Italy and Holland. So I think he didn't like talking about it because it had been pretty ugly.
Bill, you've worked for several newspapers. Describe what a newspaper office was like during their heyday.
I spent a lot of my career as a one-person bureau, and by myself basically work. But in the early days of it, I was a reporter and city editor in a daily newsroom, and I worked there with several good friends of mine who are still friends of mine. And it was very exciting. It was just a lot of activity going on. It was a small paper, and we were racing back and forth. It was in northern Idaho, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
What was the name of the paper?
The Coeur d'Alene Press.
Okay.
And I was a reporter, cops and crime reporter, and then a government reporter and a feature writer, and then a city editor of that. So I got a chance to do a lot of different things. And I really I was in my 20s, and it was really a rush. I really enjoyed it, and just thought it was fascinating.
Did you dabble in newspaper writing or writing in college?
No, I had never did anything like that in college, and I took up newspapers just as just sort of a wild idea to try to find some line of work after getting out of college and not wanting to be a teacher.
Why Idaho?
I got a job with a little paper in Virginia right after I decided to try it, but I couldn't seem to get any advance very quickly anywhere else, and I thought, well, I might as well, if I'm going to work for a tiny little paper, it might as well be, I might as well hit the road. I don't know. It just seemed like a good idea at the time, so I just traveled out west and applied at a bunch of little papers that I thought might hire me, and I literally rode around there in a van, and I'd pull into a town and look at the paper, and if it looked to be the sort of paper that might hire me, a decent paper but not a really good paper, I would find a payphone and call the editor, and if he would see me, I would find a place to take a shower and put on my one good suit of clothes and get my little pack of newspaper clippings of articles and take it in to see him. And I did that 10 times in pretty places out west that I thought I might like to live, and got 2 job offers.
Have you ever gone back to read, or do you still have any of those early writings?
Yeah.
You've gone back to read some of them?
I mean, I have in the past. Yeah, I mean, I don't do it now. I haven't read them in a while.
Do you recognize the person who wrote those things when you read them, or is that not something you think about necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you read something you've written, you can always find something, I wish I would have said it this way, but I thought they were okay.
You spent the majority of your career at the Richmond Times-Dispatch?
Yes.
20 plus years?
Yes.
How did you know that the industry was changing in terms of online and revenue and things like that? Did you observe that sort of while you were working for the papers?
Oh, yeah.
And what did that look like or feel like as you were in the middle of it?
Well, by then I was working as a one-person bureau in an office in Norfolk or here at home in Virginia Beach. So I wasn't a eyewitness to it on a daily basis. But you could tell by the way the staff cut backs, and even though I hadn't, was still working there, when somebody would leave, they wouldn't replace them, and assignments that normally somebody else would have taken care of because that was their area of expertise, they would ask me, could you write about this? And I didn't mind doing it, but that was sort of an ongoing process. And as you cut back, you had more and more responsibility to cover different topics. And there's only so much of it you can do well. And I was very conscious of the fact that I had to cover, I was our reporter on a number of these topics, and some of them I really wasn't as knowledgeable about as I would have liked to have been. And it wasn't like I went out and I don't think did a terrible job or anything, but the paper, I think the public would have been better served with somebody other than me that knew more than I did, or had a little more background or a little more history covering these things.
When you describe yourself as a one-person bureau chief, your area was Tidewater, Virginia?
South side, Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, that area. But then as I said, as the people started leaving the paper or getting laid off, it expanded, and by the end I was covering pretty much anything that might come up. If there was a plane crash in Charlottesville and the Charlottesville guy wasn't around, they would call me to write about it. So and it wasn't that there was an increase of work so much, because there was always stuff to do, but you were just going farther and farther away to cover things you knew less and less about. And I think that's the real shame about what's happened to newspapers.
Do you read the paper now?
I do.
Like hard copy or online?
I get the Virginian Pilot delivered at my home, and the Wall Street Journal, which my wife got, but which I read a lot, and I get the online version of the New York Times.
In 1991, you were working for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and you wandered into a speaker's forum about U-boats and saw a 70-year-old who was describing being on the beach and seeing a couple of ships blow up during World War II.
Yes.
Describe the wandering. For a moment, like where were you? Like, where was the forum?
It was just one of the hotels down on the ocean front. They had like a conference room, and the event was there, and the fellow was talking in the area. He was just pointing. He said, right out here, and he meant like because we were at the beach, so it was right outside the building we were in. He was saying, this is where I was standing when I saw this. It just surprised me.
If you had to make a 1 to 2 minute pitch as to what your book, The Mathews Men, is about, how would you describe it?
It uses the adventures of this unusual group of sea captains and merchant mariners from the small community of Mathews County, Virginia. It uses what they did in their experiences in World War II to tell the story of the U.S. Merchant Marine and what it did in World War II. I tried to write it like an adventure story, but it really is, I think people would read it and get an idea that these guys in the Merchant Marine went through a lot of very hard stuff. Probably were not very well rewarded for it at the end.
Explain what a Merchant Marine did during World War II. They were basically the supply chain for the Allies.
They weren't military. They were civilians who sailed cargo ships, and they worked for private companies, and they do it for profit generally. But in wartime, they get pressed into service as hauling war supplies. So in World War II, they were sailing these merchant ships, cargo ships, in the service of the government, hauling planes and tanks and fuel and everything that the American or the Allied forces needed on the foreign battlefields.
The main
supply line.
Instruments of war, but also things like insect repellent and smaller items that you would certainly need too.
Everything they needed to survive and to fight on foreign soil.
Why Mathews County, Virginia?
Well, Mathews was to me a natural place because it's a very small, isolated community, and it's very much on the water. It's at the end of a peninsula that sticks out into the Chesapeake Bay, and throughout its history, people have lived there, almost since Jamestown, and throughout Mathews' history, it's been a place where people went to sea because there wasn't much else to do there, and they were sea captains and mariners, and they had done this for a long time, so they had been doing it before World War II. But in World War II, suddenly these guys, the merchant mariners, and their ships became the prime target for the Germans, for the U-boats.
And you write in your book you were either a farmer, fished the bay, or went to sea. Those were your only options, and the job of choice in Mathews for 250 years was to be a merchant marine.
Yes. I mean, some of course, were farmers and prospered in fishing, but really the merchant marine was a line of work. I mean, a lot of families had done it for generations, and it was a job where if you could really make something. You could become a captain, a senior captain. You could really advance to the top of your field and make a lot of money and see the world. So it was a job that some of these men took, I think, for the adventure and for the opportunity. That some of the other work there, the farming and the fishing, it wasn't quite the same. Didn't have the same type of opportunities.
You were familiar with Mathews County in the 1980s. You lived in Mathews for a year or so. You were working for the Daily Press.
Yes.
What was your experience like in the 80s in Mathews County?
Well, I didn't actually cover Mathews. I covered some other areas. I just lived there, but I loved Mathews because it was I'd never lived in a place like that before. It was very quiet, very remote, and I lived in a house. I was renting a house really at the end of a peninsula, and it had a beautiful view of the bay, and it had crab pots in the yard, and it was just so beautiful out there. The job, I took a better job when I got a chance, but I regretted leaving Mathews because it was so beautiful, and the people were very nice there. One of the things I remembered is that everybody in Mathews knew everybody else, and that was really what helped me to write the book.
People who weren't born in Mathews but who moved there later are called, was it come heres?
Yes.
So what was the reaction to you by the people of Mathews when you came to them and said that you wanted to tell their story? Was there convincing that had to be done? Was there trust that had to be forged?
I think so. I mean, yeah, I'm sure there was. I generally found the people very friendly and very willing to talk to me. A lot of people I was interviewing were retired, and they have had their time as a little more of their own. So it was you could often go out and talk to several people. I think the come here references, if you're, because I wasn't attempting to claim being a local. I was
Yes.
clearly an outsider, so that didn't really bother any of them. But some of them were a little reluctant, but a lot of them really they were surprised that anybody wanted to hear these stories because they had been around for a long time, and then people didn't seem very interested.
There's a great line in the book about how remote Mathews is to anything else, that no one ever goes to Mathews.
Right. No one ever goes to Mathews unless going to Mathews. In other words, you have to go there on purpose unless you're really lost.
One of the things that really stuck out to me at the beginning of the book, and that really told me that Mathews is a town and the people are of the water, was something that I'd never heard of, which was sculling a boat. And that as kids, sort of the mark of someone in Mathews County is you could scull a boat. Can you describe what sculling a boat is?
It's when you take a single paddle or oar and you position it behind the boat, usually a small boat like a canoe or a john boat or something, and then thrash it back and forth in the water from side to side very very quickly, and it propels the boat forward. And in Mathews, sculling is a real art, and a lot of people in Mathews who grew up doing that can propel a boat faster than somebody else could row one, or a small motorboat, they used to say.
And as someone who is from suburbia, like I am, that image that I have in my mind, and I still don't really know if I can exactly picture what a 5-year-old in a boat by him or herself moving an oar back and forth would look like. But I know that I couldn't do that now as someone who's 38 or whatever. But I think that small little bit of information really kind of set the stage for the experience that the people of Mathews have on the water. Was part of deciding to write the book an effort to get the story out while there are still people alive to hear it or to tell it?
Honestly, when I started doing it, I just thought it was a great story, and I like to tell stories, and I thought this would be a really interesting story to tell. But as you talk to these guys, it's clear that a lot of them went through a great deal, and these guys these guys in Mathews are not like grandiose guys that like to brag about what they did, but in them there is some sense that they do feel a little badly that that nobody knows this. One guy told me, maybe when your book comes out, my grandkids will finally believe I did something useful during the war. So the more I got to talk to these guys, the more you get to know people, and you thought, well, this would be, it would feel pretty good to tell these guys' story and maybe show that that we could have done a little better by them. The longer I worked on it, a number of the guys that I interviewed died. I had more than half a dozen, maybe 10 guys that I've interviewed that have died, and died before the book came out. I did sort of develop and there wasn't anything I could do, but I felt sort of a sense of urgency that you'd like to have them be able to read the book.
But the reality of the situation during World War II, the first year of the war, merchant marines had the highest casualty rate of any branch. Probably isn't the right word because they weren't necessarily part of the armed forces. That's the statistic, isn't it? That they.
Yeah.
So how come the story isn't more well known?
Um, they, I mean, it's a combination of reasons, really. These guys, they were private, not members of the military, and when they were killed, it wasn't in famous battles. It was in, they might lose 10 guys when this little freighter sank off Florida, and another 12 when. So it happened in parts rather than in dramatic flourishes. The government kept a lot of the sinkings quiet. The whole thing just unfolded. The severity of it was not really plain to the American public when it was happening.
Is part of it also perhaps the image that the merchant marines had, and maybe to some extent still continue to have, which is sort of kind of unsavory characters who I
Yeah.
think.
You'd hate to think that the country could say, well, these guys are not worth worrying about. And I don't think it's quite that way, but they didn't really have a lot of powerful political friends, or they were sort of, they were, as you say, they were kind of these down at the heels guys who were known mainly for drinking rot gut whiskey and starting fights on the waterfront, and that certainly wasn't a fair way to paint them. But regardless, what they went through, I mean, it I think speaks for itself.
Describe what a U-boat is and what life on a U-boat was like.
Well, a U-boat is as I say in the book, it's not a submarine like you think of a submarine today. You have the big boomers, the subs now that are very self-contained, can stay under the water for months at a time without even communicating. The U-boats weren't that way. They were diving vessels. They were much better on the surface. They were faster. They were more maneuver. Everything about them was better on the surface, but they could submerge for brief periods of time. And they switching over to battery power, as I've said, like a Prius, and submerge for brief periods, a few hours at a stretch, to attack or to escape from pursuers or to escape from bad weather. And they were very good at this, at hitting and running. But if they were found, if they were driven underwater and located and attacked, they were pretty helpless. And life inside a U-boat was very difficult. The air was foul, and the food was probably rancid, and they were always subject to attack. It was crowded in there, and it was everything had to be done a certain way. I cite one example in the book where a toilet that was flushed at the wrong sequence, without the exact sequence of things you had to do, it ended up causing the U-boat to be destroyed. So it was a very tough place to work.
I'm sure there are whole volumes written only about U-boats. I can imagine that selecting certain facts and paring it down so that it is accessible could have been a challenge in terms of the editing process.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the writing and editing, I purposely, in this, not only the section about U-boats, but some other sections of the book, I would give drafts of it to people that I knew, like my wife and my kids, who had no interest in U-boats, no interest in World War II. And I would say, okay, read this section about U-boats, and anything in here that you think isn't interesting or is jargony, so that it presumes more of an understanding of U-boats or whatever that you have, just circle it and I'll fix it. And that's how I would approach it. But I also showed it to people who knew a lot about U-boats, and I'd say if there's anything in here that is not right or is misleading. So I mean, I'm sure there's still some areas in here, but I really tried to make it at the same time accurate, but readable and hopefully interesting to somebody who is not specifically into U-boats before reading the book.
When a merchant ship gets hit, I was struck by how many different ways the men could die, and I guess in a very small case, some women also. I guess initially before I read, I was like, oh, you got torpedoed and you died, but oftentimes the people wouldn't die because of the initial torpedoing or the impact. And there was this whole, I think you described it as like a gauntlet of ways that the men died, even if you were lucky enough to survive the initial blast.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that interested me a lot in the research. I was going through there, and I mentioned a little booklet that was written about how to abandon ship, and it was literally a step-by-step guide to what to do to hopefully keep from getting killed when your ship was torpedoed. And one of the things it stressed was that the most dangerous time in a torpedoing was not when the torpedo struck or a fire that erupted, but was in the getting of a person from the ship safely into a lifeboat or onto a raft. The transition by water from the big ship to a little ship, and then getting away from the big ship, because a big ship that is sinking is like a death trap. I mean, it seems to reach out to you or pull on you or does these things. So that it said that was the moment of greatest risk, was the transfer.
Describe some of the things that did happen to survivors that made it off the main vessel.
Well, there are some terrible stories about some guy, for example, some guys in the Gulf who were on an oil tanker that was torpedoed, and it was only, I think, not very far from the from the mouth of the Mississippi, and they're out floating in the Gulf, and it's summertime. They don't have a raft or anything. They have some old pieces of wood that are floating, and they're covered with oil. The ship keeps rupturing down on the bottom where it is and sending up these great masses of debris and oil, and they're just they're lying out there in the broiling sun, covered with oil, just exhausted, trying to hang on to these pieces of wood.
Which gets into your eyes, can shut your eyelids, can catch fire, certainly, which was described sometimes in the book. There are great stories of humanity. It seemed like everything that could go wrong went wrong, but also everything that could go right sometimes went right also.
Right. Every trip in a lifeboat like that was just there were just so many variables, so many different things that could just happen unexpectedly, like with the weather, with the people in the boat, might lose their minds. You could get found, you could be attacked by a shark. I mean, there was
lots of that.
It was just hard to tell what would happen next.
Describe what a 1940s lifeboat looked like.
Right. A modern lifeboat, if you've seen it in like Captain Phillips, the movie, is pretty much enclosed to help you survive. It's got stuff in there to eat and drink, and it's enclosed so that if it's tossed by the sea, you'll be okay. But the 1940s lifeboats were open at the top. They were just little boats, and they were supposed to have water and food, but depending on how well they were maintained, they might or might not. They could be rowed. If you had the oars they were supposed to have, and they had a little sail that you could step and sail the boat. And they were pretty sturdy. They often outlived the people who got into them.
Talk about how the code of the sea sometimes trumped military orders. At times, the U-boat captains showed mercy and compassion towards the survivors, which was something that was very surprising to me, because certainly, at least in school, I guess rightly so, the Nazis are depicted as these sort of bloodthirsty killers, but there were some amazing stories of compassion, and the code of the sea often eclipsed the military orders.
That's true. And of course, there was no shortage of bloodthirsty killers, but there were a number of the other men, the U-boat captains in particular. They were captains of their own ship. They were thousands of miles from Berlin, so they could sort of to some degree do what they were in charge of their own, what they did. And a number of them, after they would torpedo a merchant ship, not a U.S. Navy warship with the enemy sailors on there, but a merchant ship with civilians who'd been hauling cargo. Probably the merchant ship it was unarmed. It had no guns. It was really no threat to them. So after they had torpedoed it, they felt bad leaving the survivors in a lifeboat or on a raft out there in the middle of the ocean to die. So they would, in a number of cases, give them food, water, give them the directions to the nearest land. They'd offer to tow them a distance. A number of them went out of their way to try to do something for these guys that they had just consigned to a lifeboat.
You described a little bit ago about the manual that was sort of pushed into publication about how to survive a shipwreck. There was a part about how to survive if you are abandoned and you get marooned on an island in the Arctic.
Right.
How do you carve up a polar bear, Bill?
Well, according to this booklet, and this was some of the convoys led to Russia led through the Arctic, and the ships would be sunk, and people actually would be marooned on remote islands in the Arctic. So the book actually suggested this as a way of surviving. And you kill a polar bear, you shoot him right behind the shoulder blades, according to this book, because that will pierce his heart. Don't shoot him in the water because you're not going to be able to pull him out. And you don't cook him because he's too tough. You have to eat him raw. The book stressed that above all, it said, avoid polar bear liver.
What's the longest anyone survived once they found themselves in a lifeboat?
I don't know what the longest record would be. There were some men that drifted for, I believe, 5,400 miles in the South Atlantic. Ended up on the coast of Chile or something like that. And but a couple of the Mathews men were in lifeboats for 2 months, and they were catching fish to eat and drinking, collecting rainwater in buckets, and there were ways that you could, if you were desperate, that you could find ways to eat or drink, and maybe find some cover, to cover you up from the sun and the rain. But it was after a few weeks, it became very desperate in some of those boats.
At times during the war, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. The Nazi U-boats were sinking merchant ships. And then as the tide of the war turned, the Allies did the shooting and the Nazis became the hunted. The image that I had reading being trapped inside a vessel and knowing that you were going down without having the capability of escaping overboard into the water is a horrifying idea. And it happened a lot. Did you ever find yourself feeling bad for the Nazis?
I mean, you could certainly feel bad for the human beings in those U-boats.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the men on the U-boats were ardent Nazis; others were not. You get into the whole debate about the serving in the armed forces under Hitler. But it's I mean, certainly number of cases where entire submarines would go to the bottom with the loss of all hands. So I don't know. You can't feel nothing about that.
There's a burial site
in Hampton. Yeah, there's a better part of a U-boat crew.
That was not public knowledge during the era, was it?
No, I mean it was. There were people that knew it. They tried to keep it quiet.
People like military insiders, or people as in the
even
public?
Even people in the public too, because they had to. What had happened is that a U-boat had been sunk off Nags Head, North Carolina, the first U-boat to be sunk by the Navy in U.S. waters. And it was in April 1942, and 29 of the crew, their bodies were recovered after the sinking. And the U.S. government didn't know what to do with them. They didn't want to tell everybody what had happened. So they secretly, as secretly as they could, buried these 29 men on one evening after dark in the National Cemetery in Hampton, Virginia, and told people that they were, American merchant mariners or something. Didn't tell anybody who they were, and left the graves unmarked.
Talk about Captain Jesse Hodges.
Captain Jesse is the patriarch of the Hodges family. The Hodges family is the family with the 7 brothers that's in the subtitle of the book, and they're a seafaring family in Mathews. He is a tough tugboat captain. Tell people that he didn't suffer fools or idlers or greenhorns or anybody gladly, and he was a very tough taskmaster. And in fact, when I was working on the book, one of his grandsons gave me a picture of him, and I hung it right by my computer. And anytime I felt like quitting early for the day, I would look up at Captain Jesse and see him kind of glaring down at me, and would continue. He was just a very tough guy, and he was always gone. He was always on his tugboat, and he very rarely came home. But every time he did, he would leave his wife with another child. And the family had 14 children, and they ran out of names. They named the 14th child Hilda 14 Hodges. They had 7 sons, and Captain Jesse encouraged all of them to go to sea, and 6 of them ended up becoming ship captains. And the 7th one started out at sea and then hurt himself and had to go ashore. So Captain Jesse was he was the driving force behind the Hodges family and the reason that the Hodges had so many young men out on merchant ships in 1942 when the U-boats attacked.
And you can see that portrait of Captain Jessie Hodges in the book, The Mathews Men. Henny Hodges, what a woman she was.
Yeah, Henny was Captain Jessie's wife. She was obviously not a mariner, but she was really the glue that held the family together. And all through Mathews, the wives of these captains were like this. They were resourceful and tough and completely hardworking. And Henny was a big woman. She wore a floppy hat and an apron all the time, and she worked maybe 14 plus hours a day, not just rearing this family that Captain Jessie kept adding to and then leaving, but she also ran the Hodges farm. It was a 60-acre farm in a very remote part of Mathews, and the farm had no running water, no indoor plumbing, no electricity, no radio, no telephone. Everything was done in the old style, and she was in charge of it. And she just worked constantly. And she was just the toughest woman that most of those children and grandchildren had ever seen. But she had had a hard life, and she was given to crying spells. A couple of her children had died right in front of her, and she had lost a home to a fire. And for some reason, several times a day, in the middle of her chores, she would just break down in tears. That was unfortunately part of her life, and the U-boat war would give her cause for more sorrow.
The great American novelist Ernest Hemingway pops up for a brief time in the Mathews Men. Talk about Ernest Hemingway, Cuba, the U-boats, and the U.S. military.
Hemingway, during 1942, was living in Cuba, fishing for marlin, as he liked to do on his beloved fishing boat, the Pilar, and he somehow persuaded the American authorities there were a lot of U-boats, marauding around Cuba, and Hemingway somehow persuaded the authorities to issue him a machine gun and a bunch of hand grenades, and sanction him to patrol the northern coast of Cuba, which was a pretty remote place, a lot of little uninhabited barrier islands. And Hemingway's plan was if a U-boat got close enough, to grab the machine gun, sweep the deck with it, chase all the U-boat crew down the hatch, and then throw the hand grenades in after it. That was what his intent was. And fortunately for his readers, he never got close enough to a U-boat to do that. And but I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say his estranged wife, Martha Gellhorn, who was a war correspondent, later accused Hemingway of just staging the patrols so he could go fishing and get around the government restrictions on the government gas rationing.
And go fishing armed to the teeth, which seems very much his style. Also,
right. Yeah, right? The whole adventure was right up his alley.
But it did inspire. There was a book that he wrote that had that sort of that setting or those components to it.
He wrote a novel called Islands in the Stream. It's not one of his better known novels. In fact, it was published after his death. But the protagonist is a very Hemingway-like guy who hunts U-boats off the coast of Cuba.
Whenever I read anything that doesn't seem to have been written from 1960 till now, I'm always struck with how eloquent letters are written. And there are a number of beautiful letters that are in the book. Do you have a favorite, and would you mind maybe reading a portion of one of them? You know what I mean?
I do. In fact, I have it. I have one right here, and I won't read the whole thing, but you're right. A lot of the Mathews guys, it surprised me a little bit because a lot of the Mathews guys never really even finished grade school. They finished the 4th or the 5th grade, so many of them were not correspondents. They weren't real letter writers. They didn't write them. They might receive them, but they didn't do it. A few of the guys, and not necessarily because they spent a lot of time in school, but were just naturals at it, I think. And some of them, this is a letter from a Mathews sea captain named Homer Callis, writing to his wife after they have received word that one of their sons has been killed by a kamikaze attack in the Pacific. He writes, "My darling, I am going to try to write a few lines to you every once in a while." He is writing from his ship at sea. "Until I reach my next port, and perhaps my effort might lessen the endlessness of these days, and if possible bring you to a semblance of comfort, insofar as may be possible for us to get comfort from the thoughts that are in our minds and our hearts. I've hoped and prayed for some word each day that would give us back the joy of living, and with each message that comes to me from our radio room there's a silent prayer that it may be the one we most want from life. What earthly joy it would be for me to have the happiness of telling you that all is well with our wonderful son. The greatest day of life would be so small to compare with such a glorious event. We must hope, even against hope, my darling, until we know that there is none left."
It's beautiful. Can people crank out that kind of stuff nowadays?
I don't know. I mean, I hopefully we can avoid being in a situation where we have to crank out something like that. But I don't know. We might surprise ourselves. Who knows?
What is the process for submitting to publishers? Or did you receive some sort of advance and that sort of propelled the book into motion?
Yes, I came up with it with a lot of help from my agent. I came up with a proposal for a book. It was pretty detailed, and my agent on my behalf submitted it to a number of publishers, and one of them, Viking, an editor at Viking named Wendy Wolf, liked it very much, and the Viking gave me some advance money for the book, which was, in this case, was generous enough that I could work on the book full time.
In order to receive that advance, what did they receive? What did they read? Like what? I mean, not specifically, but...
Yeah. In my case, as somebody who'd never written a book before, we thought it would best to submit a fair amount of stuff to show them I knew what I was talking about. Yes. and hopefully could write. So right. My proposal was probably more involved than a number of them, and it consisted of a very detailed outline of the book, maybe several pages for each chapter, saying generally this is what's going to be in here, and then a sample prologue and 2 sample chapters. So basically the prologue and the first 2 chapters of the book, a version of those.
One of the things that you talk about at the end of the Mathews Men is that there are underwater divers, archaeologists, historians, researchers, adventurers. There's sort of this cottage industry, maybe bigger than a cottage industry, of people who dive in and around these shipwrecks. Can you talk a little bit about that? There's been some laws that have changed sort of what is allowed and what isn't allowed.
Sure. Some of these wrecks are in pretty shallow water. I mean, not shallow that you would just go out on a day at the beach, but if you're a capable or elite diver, you can go down and explore these things. And for a long time, that was done just by some guys that were, hobbyists or ex-Navy guys or something that just sort of lived on the coast and did it for fun. And then as time went on in the 70s and 80s, it became more of a thing. It did become an industry, and it was dive shops and books about diving this wreck and diving that wreck. So a lot of the wrecks in the process were pretty much picked over. All the interesting stuff would be taken out, and I don't think anybody really thought too much of this. But in recent years, the government has passed some laws basically saying, this isn't everyone's stuff to take. These ships belong to government, so they belong to the U.S. government, and so they're moving now to possibly to place some restrictions on diving there. Just it's a little late to the fact, because a lot of these, it's locking the barn maybe after the horse has been stolen to some extent, because right. A lot of this stuff is all gone, and a number of the wrecks, and I'm not a diver, but divers tell me that nature has slowly reduced these things to piles of rubble. So, but I think there probably are some out there that are, that if not within range of divers now, probably will be at some point. So I think that's what the government is trying to do. And also I think they're looking to place restrictions, but also to study them and to tell people about them. So,
historical landmark kind of thing.
And some of the divers are not excited about this. They see that as the government's, the long hand of the government reaching out and doing something that's not necessary. So
what side are you on?
I don't really know if one of the divers told me, he said it's really kind of moot at this point, just because there's really nothing there's nothing anybody would want to take anymore. So I'm inclined to sort of believe him.
I guess it would be interesting, though, because one of the things that's compelling about the whole tale is the closeness and proximity it is to the coast. I think if they were to be completely picked over or gone or taken out, it would eliminate part of the fascinating part of the whole story, which is, this is what happened, and you can see it, or that type of thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I get that. I do.
For those who still live in Mathews, is life on the farm by the bay very different than it was 70, 80, 200 years ago?
Mathews is kind of, I tell people, it's still sort of the land that time forgot. It's still very, it's certainly not a backward place. Everybody there is computer savvy, or a lot of people, it's got everything that every place else has, but it's still kind of isolated, and they kind of keep to themselves out there, and everybody there still knows everybody else. And I use an example that you go down there on Main Street on a Saturday, and there's a couple of trucks parked up there with fresh melons or fresh something or other, and it's on the honor system. If you want a couple of melons, you grab them and you throw some coins or some dollars in a little thing. So it's still a place that's still sort of a country place, and people wave at you on the back roads. So it hasn't changed very much. There's not a lot of development that's gone on out there, and it's still beautiful.
Do you read the reviews on Amazon, Goodreads, or the press for the book?
I read a lot of them. I can't say I've read all of them.
Did you know that you wanted to read the reviews? Because some people talk about, I don't want to read the reviews. That would be a very difficult thing, I think, for me to keep myself away from those things. Did you have any? You just
well, you want to know what people have to say, but and generally, I think the reviews have been pretty good. But
absolutely.
But there's always going to be people that don't like the book, and you can't get all worked up about it. And I tell people that I was a newspaper reporter for many years, and when I was for a lot of that time, they would put my email address right at the end of every story I wrote. So I would come in the next morning and turn my computer on, and there'd be like a whole list of, a whole bunch of emails from readers, some of them angry, some of them, I get emails that said, you SOB, F you. So for an author, I think I have a fairly thick skin. Anything sort of you SOB is sort of constructive criticism to me. So I don't get upset about the reviews, and sometimes they make good points, and I respond. I'm not real sensitive to them. I guess if everybody hated the book, I'd feel bad about it. But if somebody doesn't like something, it's I pay attention, but it doesn't break my heart if I don't agree with them.
Bill Geroux, I really appreciate you coming on the show.
My pleasure.
This is Andrew Paul Cronin, and you've been listening to the Q&A with A.P.C. To hear archived episodes, go to soundcloud.com/QAAPC or subscribe to the show on iTunes. For exclusive content, including upcoming shows, behind-the-scenes pictures, and more, follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at QAAPC. The executive producer of the Q&A with A.P.C. is Ben Riley. The music was arranged by Soup.